Let's go to Miami, Florida, and speak to Orlando Gutierrez, who's the coordinator at the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance. Orlando, welcome to the program. Just to make it clear, your organization is an opponent of the communist government in Cuba. What's the latest you've heard from the island?
Well, the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance is a broad coalition, a sort of a parliament in exile of diverse, historic, and current Cuban organizations which are advocates of democracy and freedom for Cuba. What we've heard is that the protests continue. Over 30, as you will show in that story on the map, over 30 cities in Cuba have had protests. They're still ongoing. Cubans from the island have called for a national strike. We know that strike is in effect in several cities in Cuba. I want to point this out. That is a very good story you ran. The Cuban people are shouting freedom. The Cuban people are expressing they want to change our government. It's been 62 years of a one-party state that is a totalitarian state which has imposed draconian measures on the Cuban people. The people are fed up. And what we're seeing is an organic plebiscite of the Cuban people for change. Díaz-canel, who was not elected by Cubans, who was imposed by the Castro family, has called for violence against those who are seeking change in Cuba and who are on the streets advocating for democracy and freedom. He has called for violence, outright violence, yesterday and today against peaceful protesters. That is a call to war against the Cuban people, and it should be taken with all the implications and ramifications of that intent by the international community.
Orlando, very interesting that you picked out that very one word. I mean, when you see those pictures of people shouting libertad and calling for freedom from their own government in Cuba, how much of a risk are they taking?
They're taking a total risk. You know, I know the world has been subjected to a legend about what the Cuban regime is. In reality, it's a totalitarian regime which took one of the most productive economies in Latin America and turned it into a poverty-ridden state with the purposeful intention of ruining the economy to control the population, starting with the Cuban countryside. Cubans are fed up of not being able to feed themselves, to having to import foods from other countries when Cuba was always a country that fed itself and exported foods. Cubans want the right to think, to worship, to assemble freely, to have their own businesses, to labor and have their own wealth. You know, wherever Cuban exile communities have been established, they've prospered economically. The one reason why Cubans don't prosper in Cuba is due to the fact that there's again, a totalitarian regime which strictly controls the economy and doesn't respect individual rights. People are screaming not just liberty, they're screaming down with the dictatorship. They're saying homeland and life. They're saying we want a new Cuba. That's what you're hearing in Spanish. It's very clear what they want. They want change. And we in the Cuban American community are fully supportive of this change. And we're calling for the international community to stand with the Cuban people and to protect them if necessary from the violence that dictator Díaz-canel has called for.
The mayor of Miami has spoken about this situation, and he seems to be making it clear that this is a moment that the opposition should be seizing. Do you realistically think that this is the start of a longer-lasting popular protest movement, one that could actually remove the government? I mean, realistically, rather than the hopes. I mean, those hopes amongst the people like you who have been opponents of the communist government for decades now, I mean, that's been there, but it's only been a hope until now.
Objectively, there's been uprisings throughout the history of this regime, but they've been isolated and the regime has crushed them. For the first time, we have a sustained national uprisings of thousands of Cubans who have overwhelmed the intricate repressive system set up to control Cubans. When you know how the Cuban police state runs and you look at what's going on in Cuba, you realize the Cuban people have scored their first victory by overwhelming all the filters of repression and standing up for their rights. Secondly, there's a case that is very dear to Cuban Americans and is very dear to Turkey, and that case is Syria. The Syrian people rose up against the regime, Assad's regime, and we've seen the bloodshed that Assad unleashed on the Syrian people. We're very much afraid that the same thing will happen in Cuba because the Castro-Canel regime is following the same guideline as the Assad regime, calling for violence against the Cuban people, putting out into the streets the paramilitaries and the special Black Beret forces, who have begun to kill, to strike at Cubans, house by house searches with hundreds of arrested and detained. It's very similar to what happened in Syria. So you must understand what we fear. What we fear is a bloodbath in Cuba. And we ask, based on what happened in Syria, based on what happened in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and the international community, led by the United States and other democratic countries, stand with the Cuban people and their right to be free.
So therefore, what action or what position do you think the US government should be taking right now?
Well, I think definitely that the regime is trying to knock down internet throughout Cuba. The U.S. government should be providing internet for Cubans throughout the island. The U.S. has the technology to do so. And in no uncertain terms, the U.S. should use the legal instruments at its disposal to warrant an international military intervention to defend the Cuban people and bring this regime to an end. This is an illegitimate regime. It was not elected by anyone. There's been no multi-party elections in Cuba since 1959 for the past 62 years. The rights of the Cuban people are not respected. Cubans aren't sovereign. It's time to return sovereignty to the Cuban people. The Cubans are on the street demanding that sovereignty and that freedom. We ask for the free world to support us. Not just the United States, the entire international democratic community, which includes Turkey, of course.
Orlando, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Orlando Gutierrez in Miami, Florida.